911 dispatch. What's the dumbest reason someone has called? When they released our city's stupidest 911 calls a few years ago, this was one. There's a deer in my yard. A weekly occurrence here. What is it doing? It's looking at me. When I first started, one of the first calls I took was for a gentleman who stated but sucked my vibrator all the way in, and I can't shit. Sorry, I mean I can't poop it out. He was right. Medics aren't going to try and fish it out, so off to the hospital he went. As a newbie, I remember thinking, that must be a 1 in a million call. 20 plus years in, I've learned that it's not. In fact, things stuck in the but calls are fairly common. I had a woman call and tell me a UFO had landed in her driveway. I was a little taken aback, so I asked her to describe it, while I dispatched officers using her exact wording. Of course officers scoffed, but still went en route. She said there was a silver metallic object that came out of the sky and landed in her drive. Officers arrived on scene and there was a silver metallic object in her driveway. It was dark out at this time, so they approached it and found it to be a weather balloon. So it could actually be classed as a UFO. It had instructions on how to return it, so officers returned it a few days later. I was doing work at a dispatch center when a 911 call came in from a woman who said that she came home and heard a burglar upstairs. This was in a small town that doesn't get much crime. The town sent 5 of their own cops plus they requested mutual aid from 2 neighboring towns. A total of about 10 officers cordoned off the area and set up a perimeter. Cops went into the house looking for the burglar. They found that the noise was caused by a Roomba that got trapped in a closet. The vacuum was banging against the walls and the closet door trying to escape. No arrests were made that day. Fortunately, no one was injured either. I had a guy call 911 and wanted to report that a woman had stolen his money. We were swamped that night, so I kept him on the line trying to get further information. Upon asking a few more questions about the woman and her description, it was obvious he was describing a prostitute. He then began to cry and begged me to not judge him for hiring a prostitute. I promised him I wouldn't judge him and I would send him an officer as soon as we had one available. He hung up and I pended the call as the woman was no longer on scene. He called back on 911 less than a minute later and proceeded to want to talk about his hiring a prostitute until officers arrived. My partner and I continued to pick up his call after we had to place him on hold several times to take other 911 calls during the 15-minute period it took for officers to get to him. He ended up getting arrested for disorderly conduct that night as he was extremely intoxicated and decided he wanted to have a go at the officers when they arrived. Because their electricity went out and they wanted the police to fix it. Then got upset when I told them they needed to call their power company. I've also had someone call because their neighbor's tree was dropping leaves into their yard and they wanted the neighbor to clean it up. And one of the funniest / most ridiculous, because someone's automatic sprinklers turned on while they were walking their dog and they got wet. Wanted to press assault charges. People call for the most petty things ever. I would always have them call back on the non-emergency line as soon as they told me the ridiculousness. 911 is for emergencies only, boys and girls. She got shampoo in her eye while showering. She rinsed it out and her vision was unaffected, but it, really stung for a minute. She was 27 and could not be talked out of having paramedics dispatched. When the medics got there, they couldn't talk her out of going to the hospital. She was fine, at least until she got word from her insurance company that they weren't going to pay for her frivolous and unnecessary ambulance ride. Not dispatch, but I used to field emergency court in the UK. Emergency court is more or less 24-hour walk-in. It's strictly for cases that can't wait to be heard in regular court. Deportation, life support, emergency custody. Serious stuff. That did not dissuade some dude from turning up and demanding that we stop his neighbor's cat from trespassing on his land though. He ended up being fined later for repeatedly calling 999 over it. People call us all the time because they are not from a rural area and they think their 2-wheel drive vehicle can go over our mountain roads. They get stuck and somehow think because they are on federal ground that we are obligated to help them. We are not. Usually, these brainiacs who take their 1988 Accord over forest highways also don't bring anything warm to wear, or any extra food either. When they do remember to bring something, it is usually a child that won't do well in the cold overnight. And when they get stuck and learn that AAA does not go 50 miles off of the pavement to come save you, they really start to panic. Either you have $3,000 for a private tow to maybe come get you, a long hike out, or you are truly in danger, and then maybe a search and rescue team will come out, at which point you may again receive a bill for their services. People, just come a little bit prepared please. To come to their 3rd floor apartment and change the TV channel. Somewhat innocuous, especially considering that the subject calling was quadriplegic. But 30 days and 150 calls with the same request later, it got pretty old. 150 calls in a month is nowhere near the record though. That record is owned by a local gentleman who called 217 times in a 4-hour period rambling on about Nazi zombie violence, mayhem, wounds and zircon ray technology. His phone was not GPS enabled, so we were never able to track him down, but at least when the Nazi zombie apocalypse comes, he will be proven right. Not a dispatcher, but a dumb caller. Granted, I was about 7 years old at this time though. A little background. My parents both worked, and my mom worked early evening to about 11 to 12 at night, and my dad got home about 6 p.m. then. So there was about a 2 to 3 hour gap, where it was just me and my much older siblings, 8+ years, at home. Well, one of these days my brothers were in charge of getting dinner going, because dad was going to be later than normal. Having 2 teenage boys in charge of dinner was my parents' mistake. However, my brothers thinking I had no authority or power over them was another mistake. They refused to make any food. I was 7 and had no idea how to make anything other than a horrible mixture of uncooked pinto beans, flour, and chocolate syrup, and I was begging for them to cook. Still nada. In their defense, Super Mario Sunshine is a really good game, and as an adult I can now understand the predicament they were in. Addictive stuff. In a ho, my ornery, impatient bud gets the bright idea of calling 911 for help. Great plan, right? They'll bring food for me and all will be good. Well, for some reason, as soon as the dispatcher picks up, I freeze. The only thing they hear is a little girl shakingly say sorry right before hanging up. As their protocol demands, we had 3 police officers show up banging on our front and back door. My brothers ended up answering the door in only boxers and blankets wrapped around them. All was fine in the end and nobody got in trouble, and I finally got my dinner. It was a stupid reason to call, but resulted in a hilarious story. I don't know if the story counts, but I know someone who had to be rushed to hospital because she accidentally swallowed her false teeth whilst eating fried chicken. And here's a doozy, didn't notice until she got another piece of chicken and tried to bite into it with her gums. An entire set of false teeth. She had to call an ambulance to take her to the hospital, because when she called family members to ask them, they didn't believe her because it was so ridiculous. I've mentioned before, I had someone that wanted a vehicle towed because the license plate was slanderous towards her dead mother and the vehicle had STDs, her claim. Got mad I wouldn't send out a CSI team, called me an idiot with more colorful language. Filed a complaint on me, then filed a complaint on my supervisor. A personal pet peeve of mine is when someone on Medicare doesn't have to pay for an ambulance ride, so they call 911 for doctor's appointments. By policy, we have to send them. It never fails, a cardiac arrest will come out, and my closet medic is taking someone to a routine appointment. However, COVID seemed to have brought the Karens out from all over. For the last 4 months it's been call after call of kids playing within 6 feet of each other. Not a dispaver, but firefighter. We were called out to a residence one very frosty morning midwinter during a very long cold snap. Because the homie owner couldn't open his front door and was unable to get out to get to work. We drove up, I got out, ready to force the door open, but tried it first. It opened with minimal effort, frozen a bit. I opened the door and called out fire department. Did you still need us? He was so embarrassed, and it was hilarious. Not a dispatcher, but someone as a 3 years old who called 911 that my dad went to work and that I miss my dad. I stuck to him like a magnet as a little kid. I'm assuming why I called 911 was probably because I only knew those 3 numbers on the phone, and seeing that you can talk to people on it. Thinking back, I feel so bad for doing that. According to my mom, the cops did show up at our house, just to check what was up. My ex-boyfriend called an ambulance to take him to the hospital because he couldn't feel his right arm. It turns out he had just slept on that arm all night, so he just needed to wait for the blood circulation to fix itself. He literally woke up and immediately called an ambulance. We live in a small town, so it took 2 minutes, and by the time he got there the feeling started coming back, but he ordered an MRI on his family's comprehensive medical insurance just to confirm. Also, this same ex-boyfriend booked himself a dentist appointment for excruciating mouth pain so bad he couldn't eat anything, and it turns out he'd just bitten the inside of his cheek. The dentist laughed him out of his office. Medic here. I worked with a medic who moved to dispatch, and he called 911 himself one evening while off duty because he was trapped in a room with a crazy cat outside the door. He couldn't leave the room or the car would attack him. He was crying and desperate when he called it in. For the next 4 years or so we would meow periodically on the radio when he was working. I'd like to say first that people call me on their worst day of their life. I've had calls that ripped my soul from me. It has made me more compassionate, and I love the service I was able to provide to my community. That being said, 90% of the calls are not emergencies. There are a category of dumb reasons people call on a regular basis. Let me give you one of the obscure ones. Guy calls in with a heavy Cantonese accent. Tells the operator my wife no do anal. I guess in China the wife must oblige the husband. Not a 911 dispatcher, but similar. I received a call from a man saying he needed police out to his house, but he wouldn't tell me where he was. He said he needed to be restrained, but would not tell me a reason why other than he was a bad man. He kept telling me he needed wrist and leg restraints and a hood over his face. In my mind, I thought he was going to hurt someone or already had, so I stayed on the line to figure out what was going on with him. He then told me to tell him he was a bad man and deserved to be restrained. He would say, "Tell me I'm a bad man. Tell me I'm a terrible person who needs to be punished." Then, it hit me. I spent 30 minutes on the line with a dude trying to live out his BDSM fantasy. I couldn't believe I didn't see it sooner. I worked 911 in SC and used to have a woman call every week and claim she was going to be assaulted. I was trained to take all claims seriously, and I still do, but week after week, she asked for the police to monitor her home to catch the rapist, and week after week, the police watched her pour some sort of condiment all over her crotch and claim she was raped. Sometimes milk, at least once, it was mayo. It varied. Also, we had a lot of people calling for ambulance taxis. They'd claim they needed an ambulance, ask to be taken to a hospital clear across town, then jump out of the back of a moving truck when they reached their stop. I work for an agency in a somewhat developed area, but still has lots of woods between developed areas. Get a call for a fox running loose in a parking lot in a strip mall next to one of the aforementioned wooded areas. The caller saw a fox on the side of the parking lot, chased it down, and cornered it in the parking lot, then used his jacket to trap it. We get there, and he was like, "I saw this fox, and I caught it, what should I do?" And we were like, "Dude, let it go and stop bothering the wildlife." He reluctantly lets it go. To this day I think that he was so proud of himself for catching that fox that he called the police department to brag about it, since there was no one else that saw it. There are so many in 9 years as a dispatcher. I once had an old guy call during the last government shutdown wanting to know if his cable was out because of the shutdown. Then there are the infinite number of Karens calling in to report suspicious activity in their neighborhood. It's always exactly the same. There's someone walking in their neighborhood that doesn't belong, and they want them removed. When I press for more details they dance around the answer. I always made sure to make them say on the recorded line it was because they were black. If you're gonna be a racist pose, I'm gonna make you admit it out loud. Usually it winds up being their neighbor who's a heart surgeon or lawyer. I've had people call because their neighbors blew leaves or grass clippings onto their lawn and want them arrested. I had another call because it was raining and their yard was flooding and they were pissed off. "Ma'am, we can't control the weather." The list goes on and on. Not so much a dumb 911 call, but a dumb decision involving the cops. My friend's dad is a police officer, and they once told me this story about this guy who walked up to her dad and asked for a ride. If I remember correctly, it was because his car was broken down and he needed to get to work, and apparently you're just allowed to ask like that, IDK. But before he was allowed to get in the car, my friend's dad made it clear that the guy would have to be pat down first. He didn't say never mind. He didn't pretend like someone called him. He didn't even try to run the other way. This guy, straight up, stood there and cooperated with him. And what do you know? There were drugs on the guy. He wasn't high or anything, and he knew the rules beforehand, but he just wanted to be caught, I guess. Mad respect to this dude, IDK why he did it, but it takes some balls to willingly give yourself up like that, unprompted.